The winter sky over the English Channel turned grey as dawn approached on February 12, 1943. Squadron leader James Mitchell stood alone on the frozen tarmac of RAF Kenley, watching mechanics perform final checks on his Supermarine Spitfire. The cold air bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the heated conversation from headquarters just hours earlier. If you're enjoying this story of courage and defiance, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true tales from history. Mitchell was 31 years old, a veteran pilot with 47 confirmed aerial victories. His hands bore the scars of a crash landing over France 2 years prior, and his left eye carried a permanent squint from shrapnel damage. But his record spoke for itself. He was one of the most decorated pilots in the Royal Air Force, known for his precision, his nerve, and his uncanny ability to read enemy formations. The mission briefing had come down at 2300 hours the previous night. German intelligence indicated a massive Luftwaffe bomber formation would attempt a daylight raid on London's industrial districts. The raid was expected to include over 100 aircraft, protected by fighter escorts. RAF Fighter Command had assembled every available squadron to intercept them over the Channel before they reached the coast. Mitchell's squadron, the 307, had been assigned a critical intercept position. They would engage the fighter screen, while heavier squadrons tackled the bombers. It was dangerous work, the kind that left empty chairs in the mess hall, but it was necessary. Then, at 0400 hours, everything changed. The cancellation order came through the operations room teletype. A reconnaissance mosquito had reported heavy fog banks forming over the Channel. Visibility was dropping to near zero. Command deemed the intercept too dangerous. All squadrons were ordered to stand down and wait for improved conditions. Mitchell had argued with his commanding officer, Wing Commander Hastings, for 20 minutes. He pointed out that the fog would work both ways. The Germans would be flying blind too. More importantly, if the Luftwaffe formation made it through unopposed, the damage to London could be catastrophic. Thousands of civilians would be at risk. Hastings had been sympathetic but firm. Orders were orders. The fog made formation flying nearly impossible. Pilots would be at risk of collision with their own wingmen, let alone engaging enemy aircraft. Mitchell was to stand down with the rest of the squadron, but Mitchell couldn't let it go. He thought about the docks where his sister Mary worked in a munitions factory. He thought about the neighborhoods where families huddled in Anderson shelters during raids, praying the bombs would fall elsewhere. He thought about the children evacuated to the countryside, separated from their parents because London had become a war zone. He made his decision in the darkness of his quarters, sitting on his narrow bunk while the rest of the base slept. He would go up alone. The mechanics, Corporal Davies and Private Norton, looked surprised when Mitchell appeared at the flight line before dawn. Davies, a stocky Welshman with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, checked his watch. "Bit early for the morning patrol, sir. Thought all flights were scrubbed." "Special reconnaissance," Mitchell lied smoothly. "Need to check those fog conditions personally. Command wants an updated assessment." Norton, younger and less experienced, seemed to accept this without question, but Davies studied Mitchell's face in the weak light from the hangar, his expression skeptical. The mechanic had worked on Mitchell's aircraft for 2 years. He knew the squadron leader better than most. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, flying solo into that soup seems risky for a weather check." "Your concern is noted, Corporal, but I need this bird ready in 10 minutes. Davies held Mitchell's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Right you are, sir. She's fueled and armed. Full ammunition load for the Brownings, just like you requested yesterday for the mission." Mitchell climbed into the cockpit as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern horizon. The Spitfire's instruments glowed faintly in the darkness. He ran through his pre-flight checks automatically, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. oil pressure, fuel mixture, magnetos, trim tabs. Everything was in order. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roared to life, its familiar thunder both comforting and ominous in the pre-dawn quiet. Mitchell could imagine the noise waking the duty officer, imagine the confused scramble when someone realized an aircraft was taking off without authorization. He didn't give them time to react. The Spitfire rolled forward, gathering speed down the runway. Mitchell felt the tail lift, felt the lightness that came when the wheels left the earth. He was airborne, climbing into a sky that was rapidly disappearing into grey obscurity. The fog was worse than the reports suggested. At 3,000 feet, Mitchell was flying through a thick, soupy blanket that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. He switched to instrument flying, trusting his gauges, keeping his wings level and his climb rate steady. The Spitfire responded smoothly to his touch, a finely tuned machine that had become an extension of his own body. At 12,000 feet, he broke through the fog layer. The sky above was clear and bright, painted in shades of pink and gold by the rising sun. Below, the fog stretched out like an infinite white ocean, hiding the channel and everything above it. Mitchell checked his compass and heading. If his calculations were correct, the German formation should be approaching from the southeast. He throttled back and began a wide patrol pattern, scanning the sky with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 3 years of combat. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Mitchell began to wonder if the intelligence had been wrong, if the raid had been called off or delayed. The cold at altitude was intense despite his flight suit. His breath fogged the inside of his canopy, and he periodically wiped it clear with his gloved hand. Then he saw them. They appeared first as dark specks against the eastern sky, growing larger as they approached. Mitchell counted quickly, his heart rate accelerating. 12 aircraft. But these weren't the bombers intelligence had predicted. These were Messerschmitt Bf-109s, twin-engine fighters, flying in a tight formation. He immediately understood what had happened. The main bomber formation had been recalled or delayed due to the fog. But this fighter group, probably on a separate tactical mission, was still proceeding. Possibly a fighter sweep meant to clear the skies for the bombers that would follow. Or perhaps a raid on coastal targets. 12 fighters against 1 Spitfire. The tactical situation was absurd, suicidal, as Hastings would have said. Mitchell should break off, return to base, report the sighting, and let command scramble proper intercepts. But the fog below was impenetrable. By the time squadrons got airborne and climbed through it, these fighters would be over England. And a dozen Messerschmitts could do tremendous damage to ground targets before interceptors could respond. Mitchell's mind raced through the possibilities. He had altitude advantage, currently flying at 13,000 feet, while the Germans cruised at 11,000. He had the sun behind him. And most importantly, he had the element of complete surprise. The German pilots had no reason to expect a lone fighter this far out over the channel. His tactical training screamed at him to disengage, but his instincts, honed through dozens of dogfights, saw an opportunity. The Messerschmitt formation was flying in 3 flights of 4 aircraft each, arranged in a loose, staggered formation. This was standard Luftwaffe doctrine for fighter sweeps. The tight formation allowed for mutual support, but also created vulnerabilities. If Mitchell could break their cohesion, create confusion, he might be able to do more than just harass them. He checked his ammunition counter, 320 rounds per gun for his 8 Browning machine guns, enough for approximately 16 seconds of continuous fire. He would need to make every burst count. Mitchell pushed the Spitfire into a steep dive, building speed rapidly. The aircraft shook slightly as it accelerated past 300 miles per hour. The Messerschmitts grew larger in his windscreen, still unaware of his approach. At 400 yards, Mitchell selected his target. The trailing aircraft in the rearmost flight, slightly separated from his wingman. A young pilot, perhaps, or one whose attention had wandered. Mitchell centered the target in his reflector gun sight and waited, letting the range close. 300 yards. The Messerschmitt filled his sight. Mitchell could see the mottled camouflage pattern, the black crosses on the wings and fuselage. 200 yards. His finger tightened on the firing button. 100 yards. He pressed the button and felt the Spitfire shudder as all 8 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The noise was deafening, even through his leather helmet. Tracers arced across the gap, converging on the enemy fighter. The Messerschmitt seemed to stagger in mid-air as rounds tore through its fuselage and wings. Pieces of metal flew off. White coolant smoke streamed from the engine cowling. The aircraft rolled sharply to the left, dropping out of formation in an uncontrolled descent. Mitchell didn't watch it fall. He was already hauling the Spitfire into a hard right turn, pulling 5 Gs, the blood draining from his head despite his tensed muscles. The German formation had finally reacted to his presence. The neat formations dissolved as pilots scattered, searching for the attacker. A Messerschmitt flashed past Mitchell's canopy, so close he could see the pilot's face turn toward him. Mitchell reversed his turn, following the German fighter. The pilot saw him coming and broke hard left, diving toward the fog layer below. Mitchell followed, matching the descent, closing the range. The Messerschmitt was fast, but the Spitfire was faster in a dive. At 200 yards, Mitchell fired a 2-second burst. The rounds walked up the fuselage of the enemy fighter, shattering the canopy. The Messerschmitt flipped inverted and plunged into the fog bank, trailing smoke. 2 down, 10 to go. But now the odds were catching up with him. A glance at his mirror showed 3 Messerschmitts closing on his tail. Cannon fire flashed past his wings. Mitchell threw the Spitfire into a violent barrel roll, breaking away from the attack. He pulled up hard, climbing nearly vertically using the Spitfire's superior climb rate. The Messerschmitts tried to follow but couldn't match the angle. Mitchell rolled over the top of his climb and came down on the tail of one of his pursuers. A 3-second burst at point-blank range. The Messerschmitt's right wing disintegrated, torn apart by concentrated fire. The aircraft spun wildly and fell away, 3 down. But Mitchell's ammunition was running low. He had perhaps 6 seconds of firing time remaining, and there were still 9 enemy fighters, now fully alert and hunting for him. The dogfight had descended into chaos. Aircraft swirled through the sky above the fog, each pilot fighting for altitude, position, angle of attack. Mitchell's years of experience gave him an edge. He could read the flow of the battle, anticipate where threats would emerge, position himself to exploit brief opportunities. A Messerschmitt appeared in front of him, crossing from right to left. Mitchell didn't have time for a proper firing solution. He snapped off a 1-second burst, more to disrupt the German pilot than with any hope of scoring a hit. But luck was with him. Several rounds struck the Messerschmitt's tail section, damaging the control surfaces. The aircraft began to porpoise violently, its pilot fighting to maintain control as it limped toward the fog. 4 down or damaged. But Mitchell's luck was running out. The German pilots were good, veteran flyers who had survived the Battle of Britain and numerous missions over the Channel. They were coordinating now, working in pairs to trap him in a crossfire. Mitchell dove back toward the fog layer, seeking temporary refuge. 2 Messerschmitts followed, firing long bursts that tore through the air around him. He felt impacts, heard metal tear. The Spitfire's handling changed subtly. He'd been hit, though he couldn't tell how seriously. He plunged into the fog at over 400 miles per hour, immediately switching to instruments. The pursuing Messerschmitts broke off rather than follow into the murk. Smart pilots didn't fly formation in 0 visibility. In the grey concealment of the fog, Mitchell assessed his situation. His engine was running rough, probably damaged by enemy fire. Fuel was leaking from somewhere. He could smell it. His left aileron felt sluggish, and he had perhaps 3 seconds of ammunition remaining. Any rational assessment said he should head for home, land while he still could. He'd done far more than anyone could have expected, taking down at least 3 enemy fighters and damaging a 4th. But he could still hear the Messerschmitt engines above the fog. They were circling, waiting for him to emerge, and if he retreated, they would continue on to England. Unimpeded, 9 Messerschmitts could strafe ground targets, shoot down transport aircraft, perhaps even hit the RAF base itself before interceptors could scramble. Mitchell made his decision. He would stay in the fight. He throttled back, slowing to barely above stall speed, listening to the engines above. The Germans were maintaining formation, holding altitude, expecting him to climb back into visual range. Mitchell had a different idea. He climbed very slowly, bleeding off speed, until he was just below the top of the fog layer. The grey mist swirled around his canopy. Above, he could see vague shadows of the circling fighters. He selected one shadow directly above him and began a vertical climb through the last layer of fog. The Spitfire shuddered at the low speed and steep angle. Mitchell kept his hand steady on the throttle, his eyes fixed on the shadow. He burst out of the fog directly beneath a Messerschmitt, so close he could have reached up and touched its belly. The German pilot never saw him. Mitchell fired his last 3-second burst from point-blank range. The rounds tore through the Messerschmitt's underside, through the cockpit, through the engine. The aircraft exploded in a ball of fire. 5 down. But Mitchell's guns were empty now. The explosion scattered the remaining German formation. For a crucial moment they were confused, uncertain where the attack had come from. Mitchell used that moment to climb, seeking altitude and position. He no longer had weapons, but he still had mass and momentum, and he had 3 years of combat experience that had taught him how to read enemy pilots, how to exploit hesitation and fear. A Messerschmitt turned toward him, the pilot clearly seeing Mitchell's Spitfire, but perhaps not yet realizing the British fighter was out of ammunition. Mitchell turned into the attack, not away. This was the last thing the German pilot expected. The Messerschmitt's nose began tracking, the pilot setting up a firing solution. At the last moment, Mitchell pulled up hard, using his remaining altitude. The Messerschmitt followed, trying to bring its guns to bear, but Mitchell's maneuver had forced the German pilot to pull excessive Gs, tightening the turn beyond the aircraft's structural limits. The Messerschmitt's wing folded. The aircraft tumbled from the sky, 6 down, 8 remaining, but Mitchell's Spitfire was dying. The engine was overheating badly now, temperature gauge in the red. Smoke began seeping into the cockpit from behind the instrument panel. He could feel the aircraft losing power, becoming sluggish. The remaining Messerschmitts were regrouping, forming up for a coordinated attack. They had finally realized Mitchell was alone. 8 fighters against 1 damaged Spitfire. They could afford to be patient, to coordinate their attack. Mitchell's training and instincts were screaming different things now. Training said to dive for the fog, hope to escape, try to make it back to England before his engine quit entirely. Instinct said to keep fighting, to do as much damage as possible before the inevitable. He chose instinct. But in that moment, as he turned toward the remaining fighters, Mitchell's mind flashed back to another time, another impossible situation. It was September 1940, during the height of the Battle of Britain. He'd been a flight lieutenant then, leading a section of 3 Spitfires against a formation of over 30 Heinkel bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt 109s. The odds had been terrible that day too. His section had been separated from the main squadron by cloud cover. Radio communication had failed. They'd stumbled onto the German formation by accident, already past the defensive line of RAF fighters that were supposed to intercept them. Mitchell had made a choice then, just as he was making one now. They could turn away, try to rejoin the squadron, preserve their aircraft for future battles, or they could engage 3 fighters against 50 enemy aircraft, knowing the mathematical certainty of their fate. They had engaged. Mitchell had lost both his wingmen that day. Pilot Officer Thompson had gone down over Kent, his Spitfire trailing flames. Sergeant Davies, no relation to the mechanic, had managed to bail out, but had been badly burned. He died 2 days later in hospital. But those 3 Spitfires had broken up the bomber formation. They'd forced the Heinkels to scatter, to dump their bombs early over open countryside, rather than the London docks they'd been targeting. Dozens of lives had been saved, perhaps hundreds. Mitchell had received his first Distinguished Flying Cross for that engagement. He'd accepted it with hands that still trembled when he thought about Thompson's aircraft spiraling down, about Davies screaming over the radio as his cockpit filled with smoke. The memory strengthened his resolve now. He'd made impossible choices before. He'd paid the price and lived with the consequences. He could do it again. Mitchell turned toward the reforming German formation, accelerating despite his failing engine. The Messerschmitts saw him coming and began their attack run. This would be it, the final engagement. But something had changed in the German formation. Mitchell could see it in their spacing, their positioning. They were being cautious, wary. He had hurt them badly. More than half their number was gone. They were rattled. Mitchell exploited that fear. Instead of trying to evade their attack, he flew straight at the lead element, forcing them to either fire from extreme range or risk a head-on collision. 3 of the Messerschmitts broke away without firing. The others fired hasty bursts that went wide. Mitchell flew through their formation, causing more chaos and confusion. One Messerschmitt pilot, perhaps young and inexperienced, panicked. He pulled up hard and collided with his wingman. Both aircraft locked together and spiraled down in a twisted mass of metal, 7 and 8 down. Mitchell emerged on the far side of the formation. His engine was failing completely now, coughing and sputtering. The propeller was windmilling freely. He had perhaps 30 seconds before he would have to ditch in the channel. The 6 remaining Messerschmitts were in complete disarray. Their formation discipline had broken down. Some were fleeing east, back toward France. Others were circling uncertainly, perhaps low on fuel, perhaps simply unwilling to continue engaging a pilot who had already destroyed or damaged half their group. Mitchell watched them go. He didn't have the power to pursue even if he wanted to. His Spitfire was gliding now, a 30,000-pound piece of metal with no engine power. The fog layer was below him. England was somewhere beyond it. He had perhaps 5 minutes before he would have to ditch in the freezing water of the channel. But as his aircraft descended, Mitchell saw something that made his heart leap. Through a gap in the fog, he could see land, the English coast. He had drifted further west than he realized during the engagement, carried by the wind. He didn't have enough altitude to make it to shore, but he could get close enough that perhaps a rescue launch could reach him before hypothermia set in. Mitchell aimed for the gap in the fog, nursing every foot of altitude, adjusting his glide path to maximize distance. The Spitfire responded sluggishly, wounded but still flying. He passed over the coastline at 500 feet, too low to bail out safely. Ahead he could see fields and hedgerows, a farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney, a road with an early morning lorry trundling along. Mitchell selected a field that looked relatively flat and clear. He lowered his landing gear manually, using the emergency crank. 2 green lights indicated the main gear was down and locked. The tail wheel showed red, jammed or damaged. No choice now. He had one chance at this. The field rushed up at him. Mitchell held the nose up, bleeding off speed, stalling just as the main wheels touched the grass. The Spitfire bounced once, then settled, but without the tail wheel locked, the tail dropped hard. The propeller dug into the soft earth, and the aircraft nosed over, flipping onto its back. Mitchell hung upside down in his straps, disoriented. Fuel was dripping from somewhere, the acrid smell filling his nostrils. Fire risk. He fumbled with his harness release, finally got it open. He fell onto the canopy above his head, now below him, and kicked at the jammed canopy frame. Hands grabbed him from outside. Voices shouted. Someone was pulling him through the gap, dragging him clear of the wreckage. Mitchell's legs wouldn't support him. He sat in the wet grass, watching smoke rise from his Spitfire's engine. The people who had pulled him clear were farmers, an older man with weathered features and strong hands, a teenage boy, the man's son perhaps, and a woman, the farmer's wife, who was already checking Mitchell for injuries despite his protests that he was fine. "Bloody hell, son," the farmer said in a thick Sussex accent. "That was some flying. Thought you were done for certain." Mitchell tried to speak, but found his throat was too dry. The woman handed him a flask. Water, cold and clean. He drank deeply, then tried again. "Need to report. The base. Tell them." "Easy now," the farmer's wife said. "Tom's already gone on his bicycle to the village. They'll telephone the RAF. You just rest." But Mitchell couldn't rest. The adrenaline was draining from his system now, leaving him shaky and cold. He thought about the engagement over the fog. 8 enemy fighters destroyed or damaged. Maybe more, if the ones he'd seen fleeing had crashed from damage. All because he'd refused to stand down when ordered. He was going to be court-martialed. There was no question about it. He'd directly disobeyed orders, stolen an aircraft, and engaged the enemy without authorization. The fact that he'd been successful didn't excuse the breach of military discipline. Hastings would have no choice but to press charges. But those Messerschmitts wouldn't reach London. Whatever their mission had been, it was over. That had to count for something. 20 minutes later, a military truck arrived, followed by an ambulance. Medical officers checked Mitchell over despite his insistence that he was uninjured. Minor contusions, they declared. Shock, but nothing serious. They wanted him to go to the hospital anyway. Mitchell refused until he'd given his report. Wing Commander Hastings arrived an hour after that, his face grim. He climbed out of his staff car and walked to where Mitchell sat on the farmhouse's stone wall, a mug of hot tea warming his hands. "You bloody fool," Hastings said without preamble. "You absolute bloody fool." "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea what you've done? The chain of command you've broken? The orders you've violated?" "Yes, sir." Hastings paced back and forth, his anger evident, but underneath it, Mitchell detected something else. Relief, perhaps, or even a grudging approval. "Coastal radar picked up the engagement," Hastings finally said. "Couldn't see details through the fog, but they tracked multiple aircraft going down. 8, they counted. Thought we'd lost an entire squadron in some kind of massacre." Mitchell said nothing. "Then we got reports from the Observer Corps. Wreckage washing up on the beach. All German aircraft, Messerschmitt 109s. A dozen civilians saw a single Spitfire flying over, trailing smoke." Hastings stopped pacing and looked directly at Mitchell. "Intelligence just confirmed that the Luftwaffe had dispatched that fighter group to strafe coastal installations and tried to destroy aircraft on the ground at forward bases. If they'd gotten through unopposed, the damage could have been severe. Dozens of casualties, aircraft destroyed on the ground." Mitchell met his commanding officer's gaze steadily. "You stopped them," Hastings said. "1 pilot, 1 aircraft, against 12 enemy fighters. It's the kind of thing that shouldn't be possible, the kind of thing that sounds like a tall tale, even when you have the evidence sitting right in front of you." "Will there be a court-martial, sir?" Hastings was quiet for a long moment. "There should be. By every regulation and protocol, there absolutely should be. You disobeyed direct orders. You took an aircraft without authorization. You engaged the enemy against explicit commands to stand down." He paused, then sighed. "But Fighter Command Headquarters just rang. They've reviewed the radar data and the intelligence assessments. They're calling what you did this morning an act of exceptional initiative and courage in the face of enemy action. There's talk of a medal." Mitchell felt light-headed suddenly, though he couldn't tell if it was relief or delayed shock. "Between you and me, Mitchell," Hastings said quietly, What you did was reckless and stupid. It was also exactly what needed to be done. Sometimes those two things are the same thing. Just don't make a habit of it. No, sir. And for God's sake, next time you decide to start a war single-handedly, at least tell your mechanics to keep their mouths shut. Corporal Davies sang like a canary the moment I started asking questions. Despite everything, Mitchell felt himself smile. I'll keep that in mind, sir. The medical officers finally insisted on taking Mitchell to hospital. His shoulder needed proper treatment, and they wanted to check for internal injuries from the crash. Hastings agreed, but instructed them to bring Mitchell back to the base as soon as he was cleared for release. At the hospital in Eastbourne, doctors reset Mitchell's dislocated shoulder under local anesthetic. The procedure was excruciating despite the drugs, and Mitchell had to grip the examination table to keep from crying out. His head wound required 7 stitches. X-rays revealed bruised ribs, but no fractures. They kept him overnight for observation. That evening, lying in a hospital bed with his arm in a sling, Mitchell finally had time to process what had happened. The engagement played through his mind over and over. Every decision, every maneuver, every burst of gunfire. He analyzed his tactics, looking for mistakes, things he could have done better. He'd been lucky. That was the inescapable truth. Skilled, yes. Experienced, certainly. But also lucky. A dozen things could have gone wrong. A single bullet in the wrong place. A moment's hesitation at a critical juncture. Better coordination from the German pilots. Any of those factors could have changed the outcome completely. A nurse brought him dinner, which he picked at without appetite. Later, a chaplain visited, perhaps alerted by someone who thought Mitchell might need spiritual counsel after his ordeal. They talked for a while about duty and conscience and the moral weight of taking lives in combat. The chaplain was a veteran of the previous war and understood the complexities better than most. "You saved lives today," the chaplain said as he was leaving. "That's worth remembering. Every person those fighters would have killed is alive because of what you did. The mathematics of war are terrible, but they're real." Mitchell slept poorly that night, waking repeatedly from dreams of falling aircraft and burning wreckage. Each time he woke, he was disoriented, uncertain whether he was in the hospital or hanging upside down in his crashed Spitfire. The next morning, he was released back to RAF Kenley. Corporal Davies was waiting at the base with a truck to collect him. The mechanic's expression was carefully neutral, but Mitchell could see the relief in his eyes. "Good to see you in one piece, sir," Davies said as they drove back to the base. "Well, mostly one piece. I heard you told Hastings about prepping my aircraft." Davies kept his eyes on the road. "Didn't have much choice, sir. Wing commander can be persuasive when he wants answers. But for what it's worth, I told him I thought you were doing a legitimate reconnaissance flight. Didn't know you were planning to start your own private air war." "Thanks for that, Corporal. Just sorry about your Spitfire, sir. She was a good aircraft. Hate to see her end up in a farmer's field. She got me home. That's what matters." Back at Kenley, Mitchell found himself something of a celebrity. Word of his engagement had spread through the base and beyond. Pilots from other squadrons found excuses to stop by the 307's dispersal area, wanting to hear the story firsthand. Ground crew members congratulated him. Even the normally stern station commander offered a nod of approval. But Mitchell also noticed the looks some of the officers gave him. Calculating looks, measuring looks. He'd broken regulations and gotten away with it because the results had been spectacular. That set a dangerous precedent. Some officers clearly worried about what would happen if other pilots decided to ignore orders based on their own judgment. The formal debriefing came 2 days later. Mitchell sat in a conference room with intelligence officers, operations staff, and senior commanders from Fighter Command. They went through the engagement minute by minute, extracting every detail of German tactics, aircraft performance, and pilot behavior. "The Messerschmitt 109s you engaged," one intelligence officer said, consulting notes. "You said they were flying in 3 flights of 4 aircraft. That's standard Luftwaffe doctrine for fighter sweeps. Did you notice anything unusual about their formation or tactics?" Mitchell thought carefully. "They maintained unusually tight spacing, closer than I'd expect for a long-range mission over water. It suggested good discipline and experienced pilots, but it also made them vulnerable to disruption. Once I broke the first formation, they had trouble reforming. And their response when you began your attack? Initially slow. I had complete surprise for the first engagement. After that, they reacted professionally, tried to coordinate, work in pairs to trap me, but they were rattled. Losing half their formation in the first few minutes shook their confidence." Another officer leaned forward. "You mentioned one pilot collided with his wingman. Can you describe that sequence?" Mitchell walked them through it, how the pilot had panicked, how the mid-air collision had occurred. The officers took detailed notes. Every piece of information about enemy training, tactics, and pilot psychology was valuable. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. By the end, Mitchell was exhausted, his shoulder aching despite the pain medication. But the intelligence officers seemed satisfied. They'd extracted enough tactical intelligence to brief other squadrons, to update their understanding of Luftwaffe capabilities and procedures. As Mitchell was leaving, a group captain he didn't recognize stopped him in the corridor. The officer was older, maybe 50, with ribbons from the previous war on his uniform. "Squadron Leader Mitchell?" "Group Captain Thornton, Fighter Command Intelligence Staff." Mitchell came to attention despite his sling. "Sir." "At ease. I wanted a word privately, if you have a moment." They stepped into an empty office. Thornton closed the door and studied Mitchell for a long moment before speaking. "What you did over the Channel was remarkable. But it was also troubling from a command and control perspective. You understand that, I'm sure." "Yes, sir. The RAF functions on discipline and order. Pilots can't simply decide which orders to follow and which to ignore based on their personal judgment. That way lies chaos." "I understand, sir. And yet," Thornton continued, "there are times when rigid adherence to orders can lead to disaster. When the situation on the ground, or in your case in the air, differs from what headquarters anticipated. When a pilot or commander has information or insight that higher command lacks." Mitchell wasn't sure where this was going. He remained silent, listening. "The German military has a concept they call Auftragstaktik," Thornton said, "mission-type orders. The idea is that commanders specify the objective, but leave the method to the subordinates' discretion. It requires trust. Trust that subordinates will make good decisions even when those decisions deviate from the original plan. The RAF doesn't operate that way, sir." "No, we don't. At least not officially. But perhaps we should consider it more carefully. This war has shown us that rigid command structures can be a liability when facing a fast-moving, adaptable enemy." Thornton moved to the window, looking out at the airfield where Spitfires were being prepared for the next patrol. "You made a decision that violated orders but achieved important results. You're being decorated for it, not court-martialed. That sends a message, whether we intend it or not. Other pilots will remember this. Some will draw the conclusion that they too can ignore orders if they believe they know better. That's not my intention, sir. I know, but intentions don't always control outcomes." Thornton turned back to face him. "I'm telling you this because you're going to be promoted soon. Squadron leader isn't your final rank, not if you survive this war. You'll command larger formations. You'll make decisions that affect hundreds of men. And you'll face subordinates who might use your example from the Channel to justify their own unauthorized actions." Mitchell saw the dilemma clearly. "How do I lead if I can't expect my orders to be followed? That's the question, isn't it? The answer is that you lead by building trust, by making good decisions consistently, by explaining your reasoning when possible, by listening to input from subordinates who might see things you miss, and by being willing to take responsibility when things go wrong, whether those things were your decision or someone else's. That's not how the RAF typically operates, sir. No, Thornton agreed. But this is a new kind of war. We're learning as we go. The rules that worked in 1918 don't all apply in 1943. We need officers who can think independently while maintaining discipline. It's a difficult balance. They talked for another few minutes. Then Thornton dismissed him. Mitchell walked back to his quarters slowly, thinking about the conversation. Thornton was right. His unauthorized mission had achieved important results, but it had also set a precedent. He would have to live with that, and with the responsibility of being an example to other pilots. The following week, Mitchell received his second Distinguished Flying Cross in a ceremony attended by several senior officers and representatives from the press. The Air Vice Marshal who presented the medal gave a speech about courage and initiative, carefully avoiding any direct mention of the disobeyed orders. Afterward, there was a reception in the officers' mess. Mitchell endured congratulations and questions from pilots, officers, and visiting dignitaries. Everyone wanted to know about the engagement, wanted details about tactics and techniques. Some wanted advice about their own flying. Others simply wanted to shake his hand. Late in the evening, when most of the crowd had dispersed, Mitchell found himself alone on the terrace overlooking the airfield. The night was clear and cold, stars visible despite the blackout regulations. He could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines as a night patrol returned from a mission over the channel. Quite a circus, wasn't it? Mitchell turned to find Squadron Leader Catherine Wells, one of the ferry pilots who delivered new aircraft to operational squadrons. She was a few years older than Mitchell, an experienced pilot who had logged thousands of hours in dozens of different aircraft types. "I'm not used to this kind of attention," Mitchell admitted. "You'll get used to it, or at least learn to tolerate it." Wells lit a cigarette, cupping her hands against the breeze. "The brass loves a hero story. Good for morale, good for recruitment, good for showing the public that we're winning the air war." "Are we? Winning, I mean. Some days yes, some days no. You won your engagement, but there will be others. The war's not over just because you knocked down a few German fighters." Mitchell appreciated her directness. Most people either praised him excessively or avoided the topic entirely. Wells treated it as simply another event in an ongoing war. "I heard you flew Spitfires from the factory to operational squadrons," Mitchell said. "What's that like, flying all these different aircraft?" "It's fascinating. Every aircraft has its own personality, its own quirks. The Spitfire is a lovely machine, responsive and forgiving. The Hurricane is tougher but less agile. The new Typhoons are powerful but temperamental." She paused, taking a drag from her cigarette. "But they're all just tools in the end. What matters is the pilot. A good pilot can do extraordinary things with an ordinary aircraft. You proved that over the channel." "I had a very good aircraft, and I was lucky." "Luck plays a role," Wells agreed. "But so does skill and judgment. Don't discount what you did. 8 fighters destroyed. That's not luck. That's exceptional flying and tactical brilliance." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the night patrol aircraft taxi to their dispersal areas. Ground crew swarmed over them, refueling and rearming for the next mission. "Can I ask you something?" Mitchell said finally. "Off the record." "Of course. Do you think I was right to disobey orders, to take off when the mission was cancelled?" Wells considered the question carefully. "I think you made the best decision you could with the information you had. The intelligence suggested German fighters were heading for England. Command had cancelled the intercept due to weather. You assessed the situation and judged that the risk of letting those fighters through was greater than the risk of flying solo in poor conditions." "That sounds like you're avoiding answering the question." Wells smiled. Maybe I am, because there's no simple answer. In a perfect world with perfect information, maybe Command's decision to cancel was correct. Or maybe your decision to go anyway was correct. We'll never know what would have happened if you'd stayed on the ground. People could have died. People could have died either way. If you'd crashed in the fog without ever seeing the enemy, that would have been a pointless death. If the German fighters had gotten through and killed civilians, that would have been tragic. You made a choice in uncertainty, which is all any of us can do in war. Mitchell found that perspective helpful. War was about making decisions with incomplete information, about accepting that sometimes there were no good choices, only less bad ones. "Thank you for that," he said. "Don't mention it." And Mitchell, whatever happens next, whatever missions you fly, whatever command decisions you make, remember this: you can't control outcomes. You can only control your choices and your actions. Do your best with what you know, accept responsibility for the results, and learn from both your successes and failures. She stubbed out her cigarette and headed back inside, leaving Mitchell alone with his thoughts. The story of Squadron Leader James Mitchell's unauthorized mission over the Channel spread quickly through the RAF. In the pubs and mess halls, pilots debated whether he'd been brave or crazy. Most settled on both. The official reports were carefully worded to avoid directly acknowledging that Mitchell had violated orders, instead focusing on the exceptional tactical victory against overwhelming odds. Mitchell returned to active duty with the 307 Squadron. The fog over the Channel cleared and the war continued. More missions, more engagements, more empty chairs in the mess hall. Mitchell flew for another 2 years, accumulating victories and decorations. But the mission over the Channel changed him in subtle ways. He became more cautious about following orders, more aware of the weight of command decisions. When he was promoted to wing commander 6 months later, he found himself on the other side of the equation, issuing orders to pilots and hoping they would follow them even when those orders seemed questionable. He thought often about Group Captain Thornton's words about trust and leadership. Building that trust with his subordinates became a priority. He explained his tactical reasoning during briefings, encouraged questions, listened to concerns. When pilots disagreed with his assessments, he took their input seriously rather than dismissing it. This approach was unusual in the RAF of 1943, where hierarchy and strict discipline were the norm. Some senior officers questioned Mitchell's methods, but his squadron's combat effectiveness spoke for itself. The 307 maintained one of the highest success rates in fighter command, while suffering lower casualty rates than comparable units. Mitchell's leadership style attracted attention from the air staff. In early 1944, he was summoned to a meeting at the Air Ministry in London. There, a group of senior officers asked him to participate in a study on tactical leadership and command effectiveness. The study involved interviewing successful squadron and wing commanders, analyzing what made them effective, and developing recommendations for training future leaders. Mitchell spent several weeks working with the team, sharing his experiences and insights. One conversation during that period stuck with him. He was talking with Air Commodore Harrison, a veteran of both wars who now worked in training development. "The unauthorized mission over the Channel," Harrison said. "That's become something of a legend among the younger pilots. Do you worry about what message it sends?" "Every day," Mitchell admitted. "I violated orders and was rewarded for it. That's a dangerous precedent. And yet, you made the right decision. Or at least a decision that produced positive results. This time. But what about the next pilot who ignores orders? What if his unauthorized mission ends in disaster?" Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's the core dilemma of military leadership, isn't it? We need discipline and order to function effectively, but we also need initiative and independent thinking to adapt to unexpected situations. Too much of either can be fatal." So how do we balance them? By training officers to make good judgments, by building trust between ranks, by creating a culture where thoughtful dissent is acceptable but insubordination is not. Harrison paused. And by accepting that sometimes we'll get it wrong. Sometimes a pilot will make an unauthorized decision that succeeds. Sometimes one will fail. We learn from both. Mitchell found himself thinking about Corporal Davies again. The mechanic who had prepared his aircraft that morning, knowing full well what Mitchell intended to do. Davies had made his own choice to enable Mitchell's violation of orders. He'd paid no official price for it, but he'd carried the knowledge of what he'd done. And then Davies had died in a bombing raid, killed while trying to save damaged aircraft. His choice that February morning had been his last contribution to the war effort, a small act of trust and defiance that had made Mitchell's mission possible. There were hundreds, thousands of similar stories throughout the war, small decisions made by individuals, often in violation of regulations or protocols, that collectively shaped the outcome of battles and campaigns. The official histories would never capture all of them. Most would be forgotten entirely, but they mattered. Every mechanic who worked extra hours to keep aircraft flying, every intelligence analyst who pursued a hunch against orders, every pilot who pushed beyond their limits because the mission required it. These individual acts of initiative and courage, multiplied across millions of people, were what actually won wars. Mitchell returned to operational flying in April 1944, now commanding an entire wing of 3 squadrons. He led them through the preparations for D-Day, flying air superiority missions over the invasion beaches, protecting the ground forces as they fought their way inland. The tempo of operations was intense, multiple missions per day, every day for weeks on end. Mitchell flew until exhaustion became his constant companion. He saw good pilots die in training accidents, in combat, from mechanical failures. He wrote letters to their families, knowing his words could never adequately express what their sacrifice had meant. Through it all, he remembered that morning in February. One unauthorized mission against impossible odds, 8 enemy fighters destroyed, lives saved, but also the crash, the injuries, the risk of court-martial, the razor-thin margin between heroism and disaster. In June of 1944, Mitchell's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Normandy. He managed to nurse the damaged Spitfire back across the channel, but had to ditch in the water just offshore from Dover. A rescue launch picked him up within minutes, but the cold water and shock left him with pneumonia that took weeks to recover from. While he was recuperating, the war continued without him. His wing flew missions without their commander. Pilots he had trained and mentored took the lead, made their own tactical decisions, achieved their own victories. It was both humbling and satisfying to realize that his leadership had created a unit that could function effectively in his absence. When Mitchell finally returned to duty in August, he found that the 307 had been relocated to an airfield in Belgium, following the advancing Allied armies. The character of the war had changed. The Luftwaffe was less active, conserving their remaining aircraft and fuel. Ground attack missions became more common than air-to-air combat. Mitchell adapted to the changing situation, leading his wing in strikes against German supply lines, airfields, and troop concentrations. The missions were dangerous in different ways than the fighter engagements he'd trained for. Flak was intense, and low-altitude flying left little margin for error. He lost pilots to ground fire, to accidents, to mechanical failures. Each loss hit him hard, but he couldn't let it show. Leadership meant maintaining confidence and morale, even when the casualties mounted. He thought about the officers who had commanded him earlier in the war, understanding now the weight they had carried. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Mitchell's final combat mission was flown on May 7th, a patrol over Germany that encountered no enemy aircraft. The sky was eerily quiet. the guns finally silent after nearly 6 years of continuous fighting. Mitchell ended the war as a group captain, decorated with the Distinguished Service Order in addition to his 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses. He'd flown over 300 combat missions, achieved 59 confirmed aerial victories, and commanded increasingly large formations. By any measure, he'd had a successful war. But success felt hollow when he thought about the costs. Of the 24 pilots who had been in the 307 Squadron when Mitchell took command in 1942, only 5 survived the war. The others were dead, missing, prisoners of war, or invalided out with injuries that ended their flying careers. Corporal Davies was gone, Pilot Officer Thompson was gone, Sergeant Davies, no relation, was gone. So many others whose names and faces filled Mitchell's memories. Young men who had trusted his leadership, followed his orders, fought alongside him, gone. Mitchell struggled with survivor's guilt after the war ended. He'd made it through when so many others hadn't. Was it skill? Luck? Some combination of both? He would never know for certain. He thought about seeking advice from the chaplain he'd spoken with after the Channel engagement. But the chaplain had been killed in a V-2 rocket attack on London in late 1944. Another reminder that survival in war was often arbitrary and unpredictable. The RAF offered Mitchell a permanent commission after the war. He accepted, though peacetime service felt strange after years of continuous combat. He worked in training command, developing curriculum for fighter tactics and leadership development. His experiences, including the unauthorized mission over the Channel, informed his approach to teaching young pilots. He emphasized decision-making under pressure, the importance of initiative within the framework of discipline, and the need to understand not just tactics, but the broader strategic context. He told his students about the fog over the Channel, about the choice he'd made to disobey orders, and about the consequences that could have resulted. "I was lucky," he always told them. "Lucky in a dozen different ways. The enemy pilots made mistakes. My aircraft held together despite damage. I managed to crash land without killing myself. Any of those factors could have gone differently. You can't count on luck in combat. You can only train, prepare, and make the best decisions you can with imperfect information." In 1947, Mitchell was promoted to Air Commodore and assigned to NATO planning staff. The Cold War was developing, and the lessons of the recent conflict were being applied to preparations for potential future conflicts. Mitchell found himself in meetings with officers from Allied air forces, discussing doctrine and tactics. He noticed that the German concept of Auftragstaktik, the mission-type orders that Group Captain Thornton had mentioned years earlier, was being studied seriously. The rigid command structures of the previous war were being questioned. The need for initiative and adaptability in modern warfare was becoming apparent. Mitchell contributed to these discussions, sharing his experiences from both sides of the command relationship. He'd been the subordinate who violated orders, and he'd been the commander dealing with subordinates who questioned his decisions. He understood the tensions and complexities better than most. In 1951, Mitchell married Catherine Wells, the ferry pilot he'd spoken with after receiving his 2nd Distinguished Flying Cross. She'd left the service after the war, but had remained involved in aviation as a flight instructor and occasional test pilot. They'd kept in touch over the years, meeting occasionally at RAF functions and air shows. Their marriage was a partnership of equals, 2 people who understood the demands and risks of aviation. Catherine never asked Mitchell to stop flying, and he never asked her to give up her work. They built a life that accommodated both their careers and their shared passion for flight. They had no children. It was a mutual decision, made partly because of their careers and partly because both had seen too many war orphans. They contributed to organizations that supported children who'd lost parents in the war, providing scholarships and assistance to help them build futures despite their losses. Mitchell continued his RAF service through the 1950s. He commanded an airbase, worked in strategic planning, and mentored younger officers who would go on to lead the RAF in subsequent decades. He never flew another combat mission, but he remained current on the latest aircraft, regularly flying training missions to maintain his skills and credibility with operational pilots. In 1958, Mitchell was promoted to Air Vice Marshal. It was the same rank as the officer who'd presented him with his first Distinguished Flying Cross after the Channel mission 15 years earlier. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. He retired from active service in 1962 at the age of 50, after 25 years in uniform. The RAF held a formal ceremony, presented him with commendations and awards, and praised his contributions to the service. Mitchell accepted the accolades with grace, but felt uncomfortable with the attention, just as he had after the Channel engagement. Retirement was difficult at first. After decades of military structure and purpose, civilian life felt aimless. Mitchell struggled to find meaning in the quiet routines of domestic existence. Catherine, who understood the transition better than most, suggested he write about his experiences. Mitchell spent the next several years working on a memoir. It was difficult, painful work, forcing him to revisit memories he'd tried to suppress. He wrote about the friends he'd lost, the decisions he'd made, the weight of command. He wrote about that morning in February 1943 when he'd taken off into the fog against orders. The memoir was published in 1967 to positive reviews. Critics praised its honesty and insight, its willingness to confront the moral complexities of war rather than presenting simplistic narratives of heroism. Young pilots and military historians found it valuable for its detailed tactical analysis and leadership lessons. But Mitchell was most gratified by letters from veterans who had served in other units, other services, other wars. They wrote to say that his experiences resonated with their own, that his struggles with command decisions and survivor guilt echoed their own feelings. One letter, from an American pilot who'd flown B-17s over Germany, included a line that Mitchell kept: "You wrote the book I couldn't write myself." In the 1970s, Mitchell was occasionally invited to speak at military academies and staff colleges. He accepted these invitations reluctantly, uncomfortable with the role of elder statesman, but he felt an obligation to share what he'd learned, to help prepare the next generation of officers for the moral and tactical challenges they would face. His talks focused less on the tactical details of specific engagements and more on the broader questions of leadership, decision-making, and the human costs of war. He spoke about the importance of trust between ranks, the need for initiative within a framework of discipline, and the reality that sometimes there were no good options, only less terrible ones. Students at these institutions invariably asked about the Channel mission. Mitchell's response was always the same: "I made a decision that violated orders, but achieved positive results. That doesn't make it the right decision. It makes it a decision that worked out. There's a difference. If you learn only one lesson from my experiences, let it be this: luck is not a strategy. Don't count on it." In 1979, Mitchell suffered a heart attack. It wasn't severe, but it was a warning. He slowed down, reduced his public appearances, spent more time with Catherine at their cottage in the countryside. They travelled when his health permitted, visiting places they'd always wanted to see. Mitchell thought often about mortality during these years. He was approaching 70, an age many of his wartime comrades had never reached. Thompson had been 23 when his Spitfire went down. Davies, the mechanic, had been 31. So many others had died young, their potential unfulfilled. He struggled with the question of why he'd survived when they hadn't. Was there a purpose to his continued existence? Had he made good use of the years they'd been denied? There were no satisfying answers to these questions, only the ongoing effort to live in a way that honored their sacrifice. In 1983, the 40th anniversary of the Channel engagement, the RAF organized a ceremony at the Imperial War Museum. They unveiled an exhibit about the mission, displaying artifacts including pieces of wreckage from the Messerschmitts that had been recovered from the Channel and identified through years of historical research. Mitchell attended the ceremony, but found it surreal. The exhibit presented the mission as a clear-cut victory, a triumph of skill and courage over impossible odds. It mentioned his violations of orders only obliquely, focusing instead on the tactical brilliance and positive outcomes. Young officers asked for his autograph and posed for photographs. Journalists requested interviews. A documentary crew followed him around with cameras, recording his reactions to the exhibit. Mitchell endured it all with patient courtesy, but privately he felt disconnected from the narrative being presented. That wasn't how it had felt at the time. The fear, the desperation, the knowledge that each decision could be his last. The exhibit couldn't capture that, couldn't convey the visceral reality of combat. It presented a sanitized version, suitable for public consumption, but missing the essential truth. After the ceremony, Mitchell found a quiet moment alone in front of the exhibit. He studied the artifacts, the photographs, the tactical diagrams explaining his maneuvers. It all seemed to be about someone else, some legendary figure who bore little resemblance to the exhausted, frightened young man who'd climbed into a Spitfire cockpit 40 years earlier. Quite a show, isn't it? Mitchell turned to find an elderly man in a wheelchair, also studying the exhibit. He was roughly Mitchell's age, wearing a RAF Veterans Association blazer with ribbons that indicated extensive combat service. "Too much spectacle, not enough substance," Mitchell said. The man smiled. "You're Mitchell, aren't you? The guest of honor." "Guilty as charged, and you are?" Group Captain Edward Richardson, retired. "I flew Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain, then transitioned to ground attack later in the war. Never achieved anything as spectacular as your Channel mission, but I did my bit." They shook hands. Richardson's grip was still firm despite his age and obvious health problems. "I read your memoir," Richardson said. "Appreciated your honesty about the costs and consequences. Too many war memoirs are just adventure stories. Yours told the truth." "Thank you. That means more than the exhibit." "I'm sure it does." Richardson gestured at the display. "They get the facts right mostly, but they miss the context, the fear, the weight of the decisions, the faces of the men who didn't come home." "Exactly." They stood together in silence for a moment. Two old pilots looking at sanitized history and remembering the messy reality. "Can I ask you something?" Richardson finally said. "Do you ever regret it?" "The unauthorized mission." Mitchell considered the question carefully. "I regret that I had to make that choice at all. I regret that the situation required someone to disobey orders. But no, I don't regret making the decision I did. Given what I knew at the time, I'd make the same choice again." Richardson nodded. "Good answer. Better than saying you'd do it differently, which would be dishonest. Better than saying you're proud of disobeying orders, which would be arrogant. You acknowledge the complexity. That's wisdom." They talked for another 20 minutes, sharing stories about the war, about the pilots they'd known, about the strange experience of being living history. When they parted, Richardson said something that stuck with Mitchell. "We're the last generation who'll remember it firsthand. The war, I mean. Soon we'll all be gone, and it'll just be history books and museum exhibits. Make sure the real stories get told while there's still time." Mitchell took that advice to heart. Over the following years, he worked with historians and documentarians to provide detailed accounts of his experiences. Not just the famous Channel mission, but the hundreds of other missions, the training, the command decisions, the losses. But whenever other pilots asked him about the mission over the Channel, the one where he'd taken on 12 German fighters alone, Mitchell would shake his head and change the subject. not because the memory was painful, but because he knew the truth that the legends and reports obscured. He hadn't been a hero that morning. He'd been a man who couldn't stand the thought of sitting safely on the ground while people he cared about were in danger. A man who had made a choice based on desperation and instinct rather than tactics and training. A man who had gotten very, very lucky. 8 enemy fighters destroyed or damaged. A tactical victory that had prevented significant casualties and damage. All true. But Mitchell knew how easily it could have gone the other way. One bullet in the wrong place. One mistake in judgment. One moment of hesitation. Any of those things would have meant his Spitfire crashing into the Channel and those Messerschmitts continuing on to wreak havoc on England. The line between heroism and disaster was thinner than most people realized. Mitchell had walked that line for a few minutes, one foggy morning over the English Channel. He'd survived. Others hadn't been so fortunate. That was the real lesson of that mission, Mitchell thought. Not that one pilot could defeat impossible odds through skill and courage alone, but that sometimes, when the choice was between probable failure and certain disaster, you had to act even when orders and common sense told you not to. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts and accept the consequences. Years later, long after the war had ended, Mitchell would sit in his study and look at the Distinguished Flying Cross on his mantelpiece. He'd think about that frozen morning in February, about the sound of machine guns and failing engines, about the fog and the fear and the impossible odds. And he'd remember Corporal Davies, the Welsh mechanic who had looked at him with knowing eyes and prepared his Spitfire anyway. Davies had never said anything explicit, had never admitted that he knew Mitchell was planning something unauthorized, but he had ensured the aircraft was ready, fully armed, perfectly maintained. Davies had been killed 6 months later when a German bomb hit the maintenance hangar at RAF Kenley. He'd been inside, working late to repair a damaged Hurricane. The blast had killed him instantly. Mitchell had attended the funeral, standing in the rain alongside other pilots and ground crew who had known Davies. No one had mentioned that night in February, when Davies had prepared Mitchell's Spitfire, knowing full well what the squadron leader intended to do with it. But Mitchell remembered. And he understood that his unauthorized mission hadn't been the act of one pilot alone. It had been made possible by a mechanic who had chosen to trust his judgment, to enable a decision that broke every rule in the book. The war had been full of moments like that, Mitchell realized. Moments when individuals made choices that defied orders and regulations because they believed those choices were necessary. Some of those moments became legends. Most disappeared into the vast anonymity of history, known only to the people directly involved. Mitchell's mission over the Channel had become a legend, at least within the RAF. The details had been embellished over time, the odds made even more impossible. The tactics even more brilliant. Mitchell never corrected the stories. Let people have their legends, he thought. God knows the war provided few enough occasions for celebration. But in his private thoughts, sitting in his study long after the war's end, Mitchell remembered the truth. The cold fear in his gut as he'd climbed into the cockpit. The desperate calculations as he'd engaged the German fighters. The moment when his engine had failed and he'd thought he wouldn't make it back to England. He remembered hanging upside down in his crashed Spitfire, smelling fuel and smoke, thinking that after everything he might still die in a field in Sussex. He remembered the rough hands of the farmer pulling him clear, the woman's flask of cold water, the sound of military trucks arriving. Most of all, he remembered the weight of the decision he'd made that night. The choice to disobey orders, to risk his life, to potentially throw away his career and reputation. It hadn't felt heroic at the time. It had felt necessary, inevitable even, but not heroic. Heroism, Mitchell had learned, was usually just ordinary people making impossible choices because they couldn't live with the alternative. The fog over the Channel had lifted that morning, But the fog of war had continued for 3 more years. Mitchell had survived it, had done his duty, had made his contribution to the ultimate victory. But he never forgot that morning in February when he'd been one pilot against 12 enemy fighters, when he'd gambled everything on instinct and luck. And he never forgot Corporal Davies, the mechanic who had given him that chance. The distinguished Flying Cross sat on Mitchell's mantelpiece for the rest of his life, a reminder of that mission. But next to it, he kept a small photograph. It showed the ground crew of the 307 Squadron, taken in early 1943. In the back row, slightly off to the side, stood Corporal Davies. His face was partially in shadow, but his expression was clear. Proud, determined, ready. Mitchell looked at that photograph often over the years, and every time he thought the same thing. The medal wasn't just for him. It was for Davies and every other person who had made that mission possible. The mechanics who maintained the aircraft, the intelligence officers who provided the warnings, the radar operators who tracked the formations, the farmers who pulled him from the wreckage. One pilot against 12 fighters. That was the legend. But the truth was larger and more complicated and more human than any legend could capture. The truth was that wars were fought and won by countless small acts of courage and trust and defiance. Some were celebrated. Most were forgotten. But all of them mattered. Mitchell's unauthorized mission over the Channel was just one thread in an immense tapestry of individual decisions and sacrifices. By itself, it might not have changed the course of the war. But combined with thousands of other similar moments, it had helped tip the balance. That was the real story, Mitchell thought, not the impossible odds or the tactical brilliance or even the disobedience of orders. The real story was about people making choices in impossible circumstances, trusting each other despite regulations and protocols, doing what they believed was necessary even when it was dangerous or forbidden. The fog had lifted that morning over the Channel. The Messerschmitts had been stopped. London had been spared another raid, and one RAF pilot had learned a lesson about heroism and humanity that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Years later, when younger pilots asked him for advice, Mitchell would tell them about training and tactics, about aircraft recognition and gunnery techniques. But he would also tell them about trust and instinct and the weight of difficult decisions. War is chaos, he would say. You can train for it, prepare for it, study it. But in the end, you'll face moments where all your training doesn't give you a clear answer. When that happens, you have to trust yourself, trust your instincts, trust the people around you, and accept that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. He never mentioned the mission over the Channel when he gave this advice. But it was always there in his mind, that cold morning in February when he'd chosen to disobey orders and had somehow survived the consequences. The Distinguished Flying Cross still sits on display today, part of a museum exhibit about the air war over Britain. Beside it, the curators have placed a brief description of Mitchell's mission based on the official reports. 8 enemy fighters destroyed, a tactical victory against overwhelming odds, an example of exceptional courage and skill. All of that is true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the cancelled mission, the unauthorized takeoff, the dying engine, the crash landing. It includes Corporal Davies and the farmer and his family. It includes the fear and the luck and the split-second decisions that could have gone either way. That's the real story. Not a legend of superhuman heroism, but a human story of courage and choice and consequence. It's the story of one man who refused to stand down when he believed lives were at stake, who gambled everything on a desperate mission, and who somehow survived to tell the tale. It's a story worth remembering, not because it's extraordinary, but because it represents something fundamentally ordinary about human courage, the willingness to act when action is necessary, even when it's dangerous, even when it's forbidden, even when the odds are impossible. That morning in February, squadron leader James Mitchell proved that one person, making one choice, could matter. Not because he was special or superhuman, but because he was willing to risk everything for what he believed was right. And sometimes in the chaos and fog of war, that's all heroism really is.